Now, at first blush, this may seem to be another example of stupid PC word policing, but as you'll see, that's not exactly correct. It is actually an example of extremely maniacally stupid PC word policing. Stupid on multiple levels and from every conceivable angle. The San Francisco Chronicle reports, the word chief will no longer be used in reference to job titles in the San Francisco Unified School District in an effort, school officials said, to avoid the word's connotation with Native Americans. In a statement to the newspaper, a spokeswoman for the district further explained, quote, while there are many opinions on the matter, our leadership team agreed that given that Native American members of our community have expressed concern over the use of the title, we are no longer going to use it. They still haven't come up with a replacement term yet, which is why if you go to the district's website, you will still find this hideous slur being used. In fact, there's a whole section listing the division chiefs. And there are currently 13 chiefs leading 13 tribes, such as Chief Technology Officer Melissa Dodd, Chief General Counsel Danielle Hauk, and Chief of Staff Jill Hugendick. What will we call these women now? If she's not Chief Jill Hugendick, what is she? I mean, what word is safe? Leader, head, captain, master, commander, overlord? These words are all problematic too. They're either too militant, too patriarchal, or they recall the troubling legacy of slavery. Maybe there should be no titles at all. Maybe Jill Hugendick is just Jill Hugendick. But then you've effectively demoted all of these women. And they are almost all women, by the way. 12 of the 13 people leading the district are women. And what's the point of virtue signaling with a leadership team comprised of women if you can't give them titles that denote their leadership? This would also probably be a good time to mention the minor detail that chief is not a Native American word. Chief is an English word, which comes from French, which comes from Latin. The French word is chef, meaning head or ruler or somebody in authority. I'm not sure how we got from there to chef, as in the guy with the funny hat in the kitchen. My etymological knowledge in this area has already been exhausted, but what I can say for absolute certain is that chief has been in usage since the 1300s and wasn't applied to Native Americans until sometime in the 1700s. English settlers had good reason to use English words to describe Native Americans. Namely, the reason is that they spoke English, and people generally use words in the language they speak as opposed to languages they don't speak. So, the premise here is false, and that's enough to explain why this whole thing is very stupid. But as I said, this is not just stupid, it's extremely maniacally stupid, and to understand why, consider what they're actually trying to do. If chief was a Native American word, which it isn't, but if it was, then they would be erasing Native American influence on the English language. They aren't doing that in this case because the premise is false, but they're trying to. Ostensibly, for the sake of Native Americans, and supposedly at the behest of Native Americans, they think, erasing Native American representation in the English language. They believe this is an example of Native American language being adopted by English-speaking people, and their goal is to undo that influence? See, the left always complains about minorities being allegedly erased and marginalized, and yet that's exactly what they're trying to do here, again. When it comes to Native Americans specifically, the left has adopted sort of this addition by subtraction strategy. While claiming that they want Native Americans to be represented, all they have ever done for years is just erase every mention or depiction or reference or supposed reference to Native Americans that they can find. All of the Indian mascots and team names are being changed. Every nod to Indian culture is being rooted out and canceled. Most recently, a school in Indiana came under intense scrutiny for a halftime ceremony involving students dressed in traditional Indian attire. The school had been doing that for many years. It was supposed to be an homage to Indian culture and history. But it was deemed racist somehow for reasons that are never made clear. All of these sorts of things have been, as the left says, problematized. They've even snuffed out Native American depictions that were made by Native Americans. The Land O'Lakes Butter Girl, famously canceled a couple of years ago, was partially the work of a Native American artist. And they got rid of that too. Indeed, in a culture obsessed with representation, there's no question that Native Americans are represented far less than they used to be. I mean, you used to find references to them everywhere in many areas of life, even in children's games. Back in the dark ages of the 90s, as recently as then, kids would play, cowboys and Indians. They were part of your games. They were just part of the culture. They were part of the language. It was just like there was a certain presence there. And all of that is gone now. The representation bean counters have seen to it that Indian culture and people are represented far less than they used to be. And the thing is, to me, this is quite sad because I actually find Native American history to be remarkable and important. One of my favorite books of all time is Empire of the Summer Moon about the Comanches. Whenever I'm traveling with my family, if there's a Native American museum nearby, we always visit it. We go to Native American festivals and art exhibits. My kids currently have a teepee set up in my garage. My son likes to run around the yard with a spear that he made out of a stick and a sharp rock. Now, this all would be considered cultural appropriation these days, I suppose. You can call it that if you want to. I don't really care. But the history is fascinating. And it's even more fascinating that I, as I'm told, a racist, right-wing, white supremacist, ethnocentric bigot, have more interest in and respect for that history than the culturally sensitive leftists do. But it's actually not that surprising when you think about it. Of course they want to erase Native American history. They want to erase all history. There's a reason they haven't replaced most of the monuments and statues they've torn down. And when they do replace them, they're likely to put in its place a monument to some unremarkable person who died a few years ago, like George Floyd. They are not principally interested in rewriting history or giving their own version of it. They do have their own version. That's the 1619 Project. But really, history itself is an inconvenient reality to a leftist. They would rather erase the whole thing. There's too much in history, especially Native American history, but really all history, the whole history of the human race, that's troublesome to the left and incongruent with their claims and their narratives. So they just don't want to talk about it at all. Their priority is to sever all people from their history, from history itself, and have us all live as though the world itself came into being at the turn of this current millennium. They don't want any of us to be rooted too deeply or too connected with our ancestors or too in touch with our past. Because what they want are blank slates, nondescript automatons that they can mold and shape as they see fit. That's what this is all about. Listen, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.